Welcome to Dialogue. Today, we're cutting through a lot of the noise around aesthetics and self-expression to dive into something a bit deeper.
We are. We're looking at the psychological subtext of excessive body ink.
Right. One of the most visible, yet maybe least verbally acknowledged cultural phenomena of this generation.
Exactly. We're stepping right past that whole conversation about whether tattoos are cool or artistic.
Yeah, that's been done.
Instead, we're really analyzing a much more sensitive observation that these sources bring up, that a highly tattooed body isn't just an art canvas. It's a living, breathing psychological document.
And it's a topic that crucially provokes this immediate defensiveness, doesn't it?
Oh, instantly.
Even when you're just trying to analyze it. The premise we're unpacking is, well, it's strikingly blunt.
It is.
The idea that the heavily inked physique is the body's way of declaring quite loudly, my trauma called and it wants a billboard.
That phrase "wants a billboard." I mean, that just captures the scale of the shift perfectly.
It really does.
If you think back to the old metaphor, that sort of subtle, almost accidental vulnerability.
Wearing your heart on your sleeve.
Right. And that implied, a small, manageable amount of exposure.
But the sources we're looking at suggest that metaphor is it's laughably outdated now.
Completely. We're seeing a total escalation from that subtle exposure to a literal, inescapable display.
People are not just wearing their heart on their sleeve anymore. They are, and this is the key phrase, tattooing their entire nervous system onto their skin.
It's an externalization of internal chaos. That's what it boils down to. It's a permanent physical map of emotional volatility that, simply cannot be ignored by the outside world.
Even if the person themselves claims the art is meaningless.
Especially then.
So our mission in this deep dive is clear. We're here to unpack that social and emotional subtext. We want to provide you with the context and insight into why certain images, the crying wolves, the broken skulls, the spiritual symbols, why they resonate so strongly right now.
And what that level of visibility actually communicates. We're exploring that chasm between the stated intention, it's just art, man, and the much more complex psychological reality underneath.
Let's get into it.
Let's start by grounding this in history, because the context of how tattoos were perceived, it matters profoundly to understand their modern dilution.
Right. Where did they come from? Historically, as the sources note, tattoos held a serious, sort of non-negotiable cultural weight.
They weren't just decoration. They were markers of achievement.
Earned markers. You had to go through something. I mean, think about the cultural requirements for receiving ink just a few generations ago.
The warriors, for instance.
Right, who had to earn their marks by demonstrating immense courage in battle or enduring a genuine life-altering hardship.
Absolutely. Or sailors, who would chart their long, dangerous journeys across the sea right onto their skin.
Each piece represented something tangible, a longitude, a latitude, a major port they visited.
Or life-threatening storm they survived. These were earned accomplishments. They were genuine rites of passage.
They were spiritual initiations. The pain and the ritual that was involved in getting the ink, that had to be endured. It marked a hard-fought transition from one phase of life to a more elevated one.
So if you encountered someone with that kind of significant traditional ink, you knew they had a profound story that was deeply intertwined with their identity and, real-world accomplishment.
And this leads directly to the core analytical point here, the modern dilution.
Yes. That special status has been completely eroded by accessibility and just how common they are now.
The argument from these psychological analyses is that now everything has become a justification for a tattoo.
The meaning has been trivialized precisely because the medium is everywhere and it's instantly available.
And the contrast is what gives the source material its sharp, almost satirical edge.
It's a stark contrast.
Compare that historical warrior who earned a scar or a mark after defeating a real enemy with the specific modern example that's cited.
The Starbucks employee.
The local Starbucks employee who gets a full chest piece over something as minor as a delayed oat milk order from 2021 that made them feel, quote, unseen.
And that example, it just perfectly encapsulates the shift from earned gravity to trivialized emotional energy.
Absolutely. The massive emotional cost that was previously required to justify a permanent marking, surviving a shipwreck, complete Envision quest.
Right. All of that is now being applied to consumer inconvenience or a minor transient heartbreak.
The physical pain of the needle is still intense, of course.
But the emotional cost justifying that pain has just plummeted to almost zero.
Which brings us to this cynical but I think highly insightful observation about the transactional nature of pain.
People are, in essence, couponing pain.
Couponing pain. Explain that.
They are marking their bodies with these permanent symbols instead of actually engaging in the difficult, necessary work of processing the underlying emotional cost.
So it's a literal substitution.
It's avoidance translated into art. The sources argue they're substituting that enduring, messy, unglamorous work of internal emotional processing.
Which has no immediate visible reward.
None. They're swapping that for the immediate, intense, and physically validating pain of the needle. That physical ritual provides an instant, external symbol of healing or moving on.
Let's look closer at the specific detail used to illustrate this. Let's take the conversation around the simple, the seemingly beautiful flower or rose tattoo.
Okay, so the person claims it represents healing. A nice, aspirational story.
But the underlying analysis suggests something different, that the rose isn't a symbol of healing that happened naturally, it's a cover-up.
Physically and emotionally. It's a refusal to admit a very specific, maybe humiliating heartbreak.
So instead of sitting with the fact that, say, an ex named Kyle emotionally damaged them with, I don't know, poor communication.
Right. Instead of processing that.
They go to a fictional artist, Inkwizard69, and ask him to cover the emotional damage with roses.
The emotional pain is still there. It's just now it's buried beneath a very pretty permanent distraction.
The key is that the physical pain of the tattoo session becomes the payment. It's the price you pay to buy the symbolic right to claim you've healed.
Without ever having to genuinely introspect or face the fact that they allowed Kyle's behavior to wound them so deeply.
The transaction is complete, the art is permanent.
But the emotional debt remains completely unpaid, just sitting there right under the ink.
This takes us directly to that core assertion that tattoos now function as emotional subtitles.
It's a really powerful idea. They become this extremely loud, visible substitute for verbally articulating complex inner states.
Often because the person, they either lack the tools or maybe just the courage to do so out loud.
It's a communication breakdown played out on the largest possible canvas, instead of having that difficult, vulnerable conversation.
Instead of saying, I have unresolved issues related to profound abandonment.
They acquire a piece of ink that just screams the problem visually, often in high contrast and with really dramatic imagery.
And what's so fascinating is the cognitive dissonance, the gap between the visual intensity and the verbal dismissal.
Yes. The sources give that excellent example of the person with a huge, detailed tattoo of a wolf.
Howling at the moon.
Howling at the moon while crying blood. I mean, that is an objectively intense, dramatic image.
You can't argue with that. It carries the weight of some kind of intense suffering.
And yet, if you politely ask about its meaning, the response is almost always the same, tightly controlled, scripted line.
Oh, nothing. I just liked the art.
Which, according to this analysis, is a profound and very deliberate lie.
The tattoo itself has more specific, painful, emotional backstory than a, decade-spanning family saga. It's rich with this highly specific, unresolved narrative.
Yet the wearer feels absolutely compelled to deny any deeper meaning exists.
And the denial, paradoxically, that becomes the clearest sign of the emotional avoidance.
Exactly. They want the world to see their vulnerability and their pain, hence the whole billboard idea. But they flat out refuse to allow the world to engage with it or challenge it or even discuss that pain.
The visual intensity sets the boundary. Observe, but do not interact.
It's a declaration of complexity, immediately followed by an emotional shutdown. The tattoo acts as a preemptive warning label.
It says, I am visibly complicated. I am carrying heavy historical baggage.
And so the image, therefore, is this silent declaration. Fragile, handled with emotional gloves.
They've externalized their vulnerability, but then they try to wrap it up in this superficial layer of detached coolness, insisting the dramatic imagery is just a casual, aesthetic choice.
The viewer is meant to absorb all the drama, but respect the denial.
And the most compelling, almost chilling assertion here is the connection between the volume of ink and the volume of distress.
Yes, the more comprehensive the body coverage, the louder the message being broadcast. It becomes a measure of unaddressed trauma.
There's an inverse relationship at play here.
The volume of ink is often inversely related to their capacity for clear, concise, verbal articulation of what's going on inside.
So if your entire chest and both arms are covered in layer upon layer of dramatic, high-contrast imagery,
it suggests you have an equally high volume of unaddressed, complicated history.
The body coverage acts as a precise timeline. It screams, often accurately, that the person hasn't been okay since 2014 or whatever defining, unaddressed year, they decided to start mapping their nervous system onto their skin.
The skin is quite literally holding the space for all the things they couldn't bring themselves to say.
And the sheer quantity implies they had a lot they couldn't articulate.
This exhaustive charting of emotional history allows us to transition into the most analytical part of the sources.
The breakdown of the 5 archetypes of over-tattooed expression.
Yes. And these categories define the specific ways individuals use permanent art as a primary coping mechanism.
This is where the analysis gets extremely sharp, because it's not just about the image, it's about the inherent psychological contradiction that defines each category.
These archetypes are essentially defined by the gap between the external display and the internal reality.
So let's begin with the first one, the I'm fine walking mural.
This individual is defined by the conflict between their verbalized well-being, they say, and the physical manifestation of distress that's permanently etched into their skin.
They are masters of this performative contradiction. They will assure you, with a forced practice smile, that they are emotionally stable and managing life beautifully.
But the visual evidence tells a completely different and much darker story.
And the sources pinpoint very specific imagery here. The skeleton hugging a single perfect rose on the forearm.
That juxtaposition is just so psychologically loaded. The rose represents beauty, maybe fleeting life, or an aspiration toward hope or love.
But the skeleton?
The skeleton is an unavoidable symbol of decay, of mortality, of the remnants of what once was.
The combination doesn't signal balance. It shouts inherent instability and a kind of morbid preoccupation.
It speaks to a perpetual state of being on the brink of collapse. They are living proof that they're trying to embrace life and beauty while, at the same time, being defined by loss and death.
And the source's interpretation is almost surgical in how blunt it is.
It is. It says, this person is perpetually one bad relationship or job loss away from tattooing a whole cemetery on your ribcage.
The current ink is just a temporary containment field for all that emotional wreckage. It's always threatening to expand and overwhelm them at the slightest trigger.
So the I'm fine is a desperate attempt to stabilize the image of a personality that's constantly preparing for the next emotional collapse.
They use the art not just for beauty, but as an emotional insurance policy against total collapse, documenting their survival just in case they don't make it through the next crisis.
Which brings us to our second archetype, the every tattoo has a story historian.
Ah, yes. This category is defined less by the imagery itself and more by the overwhelming compulsion to narrate every single piece in minute detail.
This is the person who treats any inquiry, even a casual one, as an invitation to a lengthy, mandatory historical lecture.
They feel compelled to assign this elaborate, emotionally charged narrative to every single piece of ink, stretching back to minor events that happened years and years ago.
The compulsion here is to treat their skin not as a collection of art, but as a mandatory, self-curated museum tour, complete with audio narration.
The paradox is that the sheer volume, if you have 64, 70, or 80 pieces, it fundamentally diminishes the importance of any single story.
If every single line is deeply meaningful, then nothing is truly special anymore.
And to highlight this dilution of meaning, the source material uses the most specific, ridiculously exaggerated example.
A dragon tattoo.
The detailed, multi-layered story about the large dragon tattoo that represents betrayal.
By my uncle's gardener's cousin's dog sitter.
It's absurd, but the hyperspecificity highlights a crucial psychological mechanism, displaced trauma.
Exactly. The energy they put into assigning this intricate, often third or fourth-hand betrayal narrative to a piece of art.
That's energy that could be used to address the actual primary high-stakes relationships that cause the real foundational harm.
But instead, they're elevating these distant or minor grievances into defining life moments that require permanent commemoration.
It's an inability to filter. They can't differentiate between a genuinely seismic emotional event and a small annoyance. And that compulsory narration is exhausting for everyone involved.
And it proves the trauma hasn't been processed, only documented.
Moving on to the third archetype, we have a very specific form of emotional avoidance that relies heavily on language.
The spiritual trauma dump person.
This individual is characterized by their reliance on heightened, often cliché, spiritual or aspirational vocabulary to describe designs that are, in reality, functionally very simple or derivative.
The language is the mechanism of bypassing.
They don't simply have a flower. They have a lotus that profoundly signifies rebirth and overcoming darkness.
They don't have a cool geometrical pattern. They have a mandala, that is essential for their personal alignment and manifestation.
And the snake is never just a snake.
Of course not. It's a direct conduit to their Kundalini energy awakening.
This is a classic example of spiritual bypassing in action. They jump immediately to the language of elevated consciousness to describe a surface-level behavior.
And the source material is quite harsh here. It identifies these superficial spiritual markers as elegant coping mechanisms for genuinely deep-seated emotional issues.
We're talking about foundational pain. Things like growing up in a childhood environment that was 95% yelling, or experiencing chronic emotional neglect.
And the lotus of rebirth sounds infinitely more palatable and aspirational than admitting you have severe difficulty regulating your emotions because you never established a sense of safety as a child.
The spiritual terminology provides this glossy, easy-access aspirational overlay that allows them to skip the slow, unglamorous work of dealing with foundational pain.
Work that might require years of therapy.
Instead, they claim enlightenment or profound depth instantly, just by choosing the right symbol, applying the right filter, and deploying the corresponding vocabulary.
All without ever having to walk the difficult path of actual psychological integration. They've successfully confused the map for the journey itself.
Our fourth category is maybe the most paradoxical, because it defies the trend of volume.
The minimalist who's actually the most broken.
A powerful reversal. Where the previous archetypes rely on volume and dramatic scale, this person uses extreme scale reduction.
They might have a single tiny line tattoo, a simple geometric symbol, or a microscopic scribble placed discreetly somewhere.
It appears innocuous, maybe even sophisticated in its simplicity.
But the small scale is inversely proportional to the massive emotional burden it carries. The physical size is often directly inverse to the weight of the story.
You might wonder how such a tiny piece could possibly merit being permanent.
The true emotional intensity isn't in the ink, it's in the reaction.
The source notes that when asked about the meaning, a simple, casual question, they immediately look like they are about to cry.
Demonstrating this immediate, profound vulnerability that's triggered by simple conversational engagement.
That physical reaction tells the entire story. The intensity of it forces you to try and connect the dots.
Right. Is this tiny line a reminder of something trivial, like losing a favorite pen?
Or is it a reminder that they survived emotional warfare from age 7 to 17?
And it's almost certainly the latter. The intensity of their avoidance, coupled with the fragility of their display, suggests the pain is just too raw, or too recent, or too traumatic to be contained by a large, showy mural.
They opted for the quiet whisper of suffering instead of the loud scream.
But the emotional concentration is highly potent. It's a highly concentrated dose of unprocessed emotional intensity masked as elegant simplicity.
Finally, we reach the fifth archetype, which really summarizes the financial and logistical avoidance strategy.
The tattoo sleeve instead of therapy member.
This archetype crystallizes that transactional nature of avoidance we introduced earlier, but specifically through the lens of resource allocation.
It forces a direct, uncomfortable comparison between two investments: time, money, and emotional resources spent on permanent ink versus professional mental health treatment.
The choice is often pragmatic on the surface. Why commit to weekly, unstructured sessions confronting difficult truths with uncertain timelines?
When you can spend, say, $8,000 and 40 hours of focused physical pain getting a full sleeve, and then simply declare, "I healed."
The visible, immediate, tactile results of the ink are far more gratifying than the slow, often invisible, frustrating progress of genuine emotional work.
So the sleeve becomes a physical declaration of emotional resolution. It allows them to point to a finished piece of art and claim the journey is over.
But the source's critique here is brutal in its analogy.
They're essentially stacking trauma Pokemon cards on their arm.
That analogy works so well because it captures the commodification and collection of trauma.
They aren't integrating the trauma, they're collecting symbols of their survival. They're trying to monetize or collect physical proof of their resilience without doing the foundational cognitive and emotional restructuring that's required.
They want to be able to point to the elaborate shading and say, that piece right there, that represents the summer I finally figured out my complicated relationship with my father.
It provides a sense of closure that is visual and tactile, but often completely superficial.
The pain of the needle acts as a kind of self-administered temporary shock therapy, distracting them intensely from the deeper, more sustained emotional discomfort of genuine recovery.
The finished sleeve is a physical monument built over a still active emotional landslide.
Now that we've categorized the internal psychological mechanisms, let's shift to the specific visuals and placements that the sources identify as outright psychological disclaimers.
The red flags,
Yeah.
the ones that go far beyond mere aesthetic choice. These aren't subtle, they are broadcast intentions.
These tattoos function less as art and more as definitive psychological bumper stickers.
They serve as clear, visible warnings, communicating an unwillingness to conform or prioritize stability.
Let's take the neck tattoo of a dagger, for instance. It's an inherently aggressive, highly visible statement, located in one of the most visible yet conventionally, professionally restrictive areas of the body.
The source analyzes this as a straightforward statement of impulsivity. I make terrible decisions in real time.
By selecting such a high-impact, potentially career-limiting image and placement, they are visually telegraphing a certain level of impulsive disregard for conventional stability or future planning.
It signals a willingness to court complication.
And that commitment to complications is even more pronounced with the face tattoo. While artistic expression is boundless, a face tattoo acts as a massive, self-imposed visual barrier against most conventional, professional, or social spaces.
It's the ultimate life choice that says, I'm committed to operating outside the norm. It's almost a preemptive limiting of options.
It ensures that only those who accept that level of visible nonconformity will even attempt to approach or hire them.
It functions as a powerful, permanent defense mechanism built right into their personal brand.
Then we have the specific symbolism of the giant lion tattoo, often placed prominently on the chest, back, or shoulder. Massive in scale.
Representing strength and fearlessness.
The analysis here suggests this isn't simply genuine strength being celebrated, it's a form of courage being manifested.
It signifies that the person has been hurt so deeply or felt so vulnerable for so long that they are now trying to manifest courage via jungle cat.
It's a visual plea for the external world to see them as powerful and unassailable, even if they feel profoundly vulnerable or deeply damaged internally.
It's protective camouflage. They're literally wearing their desired aspirational identity as a shield.
And the size and aggressive posture of the imagery are proportional to the size of the emotional hole they are trying to cover.
And perhaps the most telling example of extreme psychological turmoil is the deliberate use of dueling imagery.
The individual who commits to having both angel wings and demon horns prominently
The
displayed.
juxtaposition is too perfect, too deliberate, too neat in its contradiction.
And the conclusion is that such duality doesn't represent complexity or healthy balance. It suggests a profound, unmanaged, and persistent internal conflict.
It's the visual acknowledgement that their identity is fractured, pulled in two entirely contradictory directions, moral, emotional, without any internal mechanism to synthesize those sides.
They have externalized the struggle for the world to see, making them, quite literally, a walking case study in unmanaged emotional chaos.
As the sources succinctly put it, sir, you are the reason psychiatrists exist.
Let's shift our analytical focus now to the interpersonal impact, moving from the psychological statement to the relational dynamic.
Right. What is the experience of entering a new relationship with someone who is so heavily tattooed, whose skin is a walking billboard of their unresolved past?
The sources describe it vividly. The experience of dating this person is not just companionship, it is described as a safari.
Or an exhaustive journey, or perhaps most accurately, a walking IMAX screening of their past decisions and traumas.
You are not just dating a new person. You are dating a highly detailed, permanent autobiography of their emotional history and questionable choices, constantly displayed in full color.
And this inevitably creates the exhausting Q&A scenario.
The repetitive nature of constantly having to ask for the backstory of every single piece of ink, it interrupts the natural flow of a relationship.
And it forces the new partner to constantly engage not with the future, but with the remnants and the residue of the past.
And the responses are often incredibly heavy and loaded, right?
Oh, absolutely. You ask about a simple skull or a stylized piece of script, and the classic heavy response is, oh, that piece, that's when I learned to never trust anyone.
Which is an immediately awkward and deeply unfavorable implication for the new partner.
Instantly, you are immediately placed in the position of needing to prove you are the exception to a deeply held, permanently memorialized belief system rooted in betrayal.
The history of their hurt is literally written on their body, making the foundation of trust significantly harder to build.
This friction brings us directly to the common defense mechanism used by heavily tattooed individuals.
My tattoos don't define me.
It's an attempt to separate the art from their core identity.
But the sources offer a scathing rebuttal to that. When your entire arm is visually defined by imagery of pain, loss, and recovery.
When the imagery, the placement, the sheer quantity all point towards specific, unresolved emotional wounds.
The analysis holds that it defines you more completely than your resume could ever hope to.
If the visual communication is so rich with trauma symbols, you can't just dismiss it as meaningless aesthetics.
The images are a defining filter through which the world processes you, and perhaps more importantly, through which you filter the world and the potential for new emotional attachments.
And every relationship with a heavily inked partner, according to this analysis, eventually has that specific stomach-dropping moment of anxiety.
The discovery of a suspicious tattoo that looks exactly like someone else's initial, cleverly disguised.
That sinking feeling when you spot that tiny stylized letter hidden within the shading.
The confrontation is inevitable and often very revealing of the person's coping mechanisms.
And what's the defensive instant response when they're confronted? A complex fabrication.
See Latin.
And the psychological analysis immediately cuts through the nonsense, asking, Latin for what exactly?
Is it Latin for still hung up on my ex and this is my little secret monument to them?
It just illustrates the attempt to fabricate a complicated, meaningless narrative to cover up a simple, deeply problematic emotional tie to the past. The tattoo itself becomes a living obstacle to emotional and relational progress.
We arrive now at the final synthesis, which delivers the ultimate savage conclusion about the psychology behind this entire phenomenon.
It really encapsulates the core contradiction we've been tracking throughout this deep dive.
The ultimate conclusion is that the heavily tattooed are the bravest cowards on earth.
It's a deeply provocative statement, but it draws a necessary, painful distinction between physical endurance and emotional resilience.
The brave action is undeniable. You have to acknowledge it. They endure the intense, focused physical pain of being stabbed by needles for 12 hours straight.
That requires immense physical grit, stamina, and commitment. No question.
But the cowardly avoidance is the emotional inability to sit with their feelings for 12 minutes.
They can handle the acute physical discomfort because it's finite and it's external, but they cannot tolerate the prolonged, messy, internal pain of emotional introspection that has no clear end date or visible reward.
They desperately want to reframe the ink as just art, a fun aesthetic choice.
But the analysis insists that it is not. It's a fully curated trauma museum, and admission to view those exhibits and implicitly to deal with the person's psychological history is free to anyone who looks.
The conclusion summarizes the difference in coping mechanisms perfectly. Some people engage with their pain by writing journals or screaming into pillows.
Or committing to the difficult, ongoing, invisible process of professional therapy. These methods, while messy, promote genuine integration.
But this specific demographic chooses the permanent physical display. They turn their entire thigh, for instance, into a detailed hieroglyphic describing an ex who ghosted them in 2018.
Ensuring that the pain is immortalized, but never actually dealt with.
And the final reminder ties all these threads together. People are wearing not just art, but their trauma, their exes, their failed coping mechanisms, their attempts at spiritual bypassing, and a chronological history of their questionable decision-making.
And all of this is done in full color, often with detailed shading, secured by a hefty financial deposit and a commitment to permanence.
It makes the statement impossible to ignore.
It is the ultimate commitment to an unresolved past. It forces the world to acknowledge their complicated reality, even if they refuse to acknowledge the underlying emotional causes themselves.
It creates a culture where the visual performance of emotional survival replaces the actual internal work of healing. And that's a fascinating sociological implication to ponder long after the needlework is done.
Indeed. It leaves us wondering what the next generation will use when even permanence starts to lose its shock value.
Absolutely. If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation and if there's any related topic or new topic that you would like covered in a future video.